We'll come back to the panel. Time to talk to Labor's Clare O'Neil, and to take us there, here was Anthony Albanese on the closed border.
The big danger for Australia is if we don't get that right, the rest of the world will open up before us. We're a globalised economy. That will have an impact on jobs and the economy here. But everything with this government, every timetable, there's only one thing they look at, which is the date of the next election, which is why so many of their promises of funding to run out after the election.
Clare O'Neil, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on, David.
So what is Labor's view on when the border should open?
Well, David, I don't think there's a specific date we have in mind here. The main concern Labor has at the moment is that the critical things that need to be in place for us to open that border are not in place today. I noticed you opened the show with a somewhat glowing discussion about the vaccination program. Can I just remind you that the figures released this week showed that just 1% of Australians have been fully vaccinated against COVID.
Yeah, the two shots.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing that matters here. So we've got a vaccination program that at best could be described as troubled, and of course we're waiting day after day, month after month for Scott Morrison to step up and take his constitutional responsibility for quarantine seriously. Now, our way out of this mess is, I don't think, allowing people to die and allowing people to get sick, as some people seem to be suggesting today. I think our way out is fixing the quarantine program, fixing the vaccination program, and then opening up a discussion about how we open up to the rest of the world.
Well, just on that point, should we be aiming to avoid any COVID deaths even when we do open the border down the track, or should we be willing to at least accept there is going to be some impact here?
Look, it's really interesting. If we watch the whole debate throughout this pandemic, there have been voices that have constantly been saying we're going to have to allow death and disease in order to get benefits in some way, particularly economic benefits. And I would say actually the core finding of the Australian experiment here is that when we protect Australians' health, benefits for the economy flow. So I think, again, the real thing here is getting a vaccination program that works, getting a quarantine program that's actually going to allow us to bring in more people safely, and then we'll be able to open up the economy.
Yeah, understand your points about the vaccination rollout and the quarantine program, but you are indicating there that we should still strive to have no COVID deaths when we reopen?
I don't think we should plan to allow people in Australia to die from COVID as part of our way out of this. What I want to see is us having those protections properly in place for Australians. Now, when they are properly in place, I think that's the point where we have a bit more of a detailed discussion about the trade-offs here. But David, we are a long way from that, and that is because we've got a federal government that had two responsibilities in this: vaccinations, quarantine, and they are doing a very average job at both those things. They need to pick up their game.
Let's turn to aged care. Now, some of the peak groups in the sector have welcomed the government's response to the Royal Commission, but say more will be needed. What do you think?
David, I'm really pleased that you're talking about aged care today, because one of the frustrations I've had is that this incredibly important issue for the country keeps getting overshadowed by the events of the day in politics. Can I just remind you, we've had a $104 million Royal Commission here, which has told us that we have an aged care system today that is in absolute crisis. It's a deep and broad crisis where most of the people who are using this system today are experiencing some form of neglect. One of the worst things that the Royal Commission told us is that 2/3 of aged care residents today are malnourished. Literally, these are Australians who are starving while in the care of their own government. We've got endemic problems with the management of incontinence, so that older Australians who have worked for this country their entire lives finish that life sitting in their own urine and faeces. This is the reality of aged care today. Home care is another weeping sore for many Australians, where we've got 100,000 people on a wait list and the sickest people are waiting for the longest. So we've got a very serious problem here, and I think the whole reform conversation has to be taken in the context of how diabolical this has become under Scott Morrison's leadership.
So let's look at some of the responses from the government. One of the big problems is pay. Boosting wages is clearly going to be critical to attracting more staff into aged care. Do you support the push for a 25% wage increase?
Well, David, you don't need to get a personal opinion from me about this. We've just had a $104 million Royal Commission that tells us how to approach this question of wages.
I'd like to hear your opinion, though.
Well, I think there's a significant increase. Fair Work, the Fair Work Commission, decides the award rates in this country.
Do you support the union push, though, for 25%?
I certainly support a push for a significant increase on pay, and 25% is the number that the unions have put forward. It sounds like about the right number, but we need to go through a Fair Work process. But David, if I could just step back from this, one of the things I've learned in my time in this portfolio is that nothing is going to fundamentally change about the aged care system unless we fix the issues facing the workforce. And the government's response was unacceptable for a whole range of reasons, but probably the most glaring omission is that there was nothing in there for aged care workers. This job is complex, it's difficult. The people who do it, it's incredibly emotionally draining, and they are some of the worst paid people in Australia's economy today.
The providers say they can't afford that 25% for the next couple of years anyway. Do you believe them?
I do, actually, yeah. I think there's a lot of conjecture in this discussion about providers. There are good providers in aged care. There are very, very bad providers in aged care.
So who should pay for the significant wage increase that you're talking about? Well, where should that come from?
It's not a great mystery. The government pays the bill for what happens in aged care in this country.
So the government should fund partly the wages of aged care workers?
Of course. The government has to fund aged care pay. That's how the system works, David. We pay for the vast majority of the expenses in aged care. And this is a real decision point for the community here about how we want older Australians in our country to be treated.
But you're talking about government directly subsidising the pay of aged care workers?
I'm talking about Fair Work varying an award which would increase the costs of aged care providers. That money's got to come from somewhere, and as the government's response to the Royal Commission shows, that the money ultimately comes from government. But can I say, David, we've got a government in power under Scott Morrison here, which was told by the Royal Commission that workforce issues were central, told by the Royal Commission that they should join with worker representatives and with aged care providers and go to Fair Work jointly and ask for a pay increase for aged care workers. The government's response for that has been disrespectful. It has been unacceptable for aged care workers, and we need to push them to be doing better.
On the $10 a day increase the government announced per resident per day in aged care, there is some doubt as to whether that will improve the problems of food and nutrition, and you talk about it. Is $10 enough? And how do you ensure extra money goes into better food?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I mentioned before about the widespread malnourishment in residential aged care today. And the Royal Commission, again, gave us really clear guidance about what they want us to do about this. It's obviously a human rights crisis in aged care that so many older Australians are starving under the care of their own government. So the Royal Commission said that it wanted a $10 per bed per day increase to aged care providers. And the Royal Commission's recommendation is very specific about the strings that it wanted attached to that additional increase. It's a lot of money. It ends up being $3.2 billion as part of this broader package. So the Royal Commission said it's got to be tied to nutrition, it's got to be tied to registration of the aged care providers, the increased spending on food has to be reported, and that should be made public. So it was actually, I think, a really good recommendation. Well, the government didn't follow that recommendation. The government instead is writing a $3.2 billion cheque to aged care providers with no strings attached. There is no reason to believe that anything in the government's response will solve the malnourishment crisis in aged care.
So just on that, do you think some of this will be pocketed, that it will simply improve the profits of aged care providers?
I have absolutely no doubt about that, David, because the Royal Commission shows us, one of the findings of the Royal Commission was that over time, money that is given to aged care providers for care is not always spent on care. And what we saw coming out of the government's Royal Commission response was a lovely increase to some of the listed companies that run aged care facilities around the country, because it's obvious. Some aged care providers are doing amazing work. They will spend the money on care, but many are not, and we need to make sure that there's accountability here. So if I can just say, one of the things that Labor would do very differently here, because this is not the only example where the government essentially is letting providers do what they want. One of the things Labor wants is for this to be an accountable, transparent system where my constituents pay taxes for better care, it goes to better care.
Is there a place for for-profit operators in aged care?
Well, look, I think if we were going to have that conversation seriously, the Royal Commission would have provided us a recommendation about that. It doesn't do that. It's one of those systems in Australia where perhaps if you were starting, with a blank sheet of paper, you might do it differently. But we are where we are, and what we need is proper accountability for providers, accepting that some providers do a wonderful job of caring for older Australians, but others don't. And one of the things that's lacking in Scott Morrison's response here has been any sense of transparency and accountability around this question.
One of the things the Royal Commissioners did recommend was an aged care levy to pay for all of this. Is that still an option for Labor, or have you ruled it out?
Well, David, you're asking me how I'm going to pay for a policy that that doesn't exist yet. So if I say respectfully, I wish the Coalition faced this sort of scrutiny on their spending commitments.
With respect, they do face scrutiny. I'm just asking in principle, yes, whether an aged care levy is something Labor would look at.
Well, I think what we need to do firstly is put the pressure on the government. Their response was completely substandard. There's nothing in the government's commitments that will actually solve any of the problems that I've talked about on your show this morning. So we need to push them to do better. Of course, Labor is thinking about what we might do differently, but the first thing that's important here is what should the system look like, and then we'll talk about how to pay for it.
And,
a levy is not something that's in consideration at the moment.
Not in consideration.
No.
Are we fair to read into what you're saying, whether it's on the wages, whether it's on the daily fee, all these other issues, that Labor will promise more than the $17.7 billion from the government?
We're certainly going to have a different and better aged care policy going into the election. I wouldn't think...
A more expensive one?
Well, I don't think the focus just needs to be on the dollars spent here. There's a lot in this system. It's very highly regulated. That can be done by providing better transparency and accountability. There's a lot that needs to be done here across a range of areas. The thing that I think is most important here is that we have a crisis. The government has known about this for a long time. They've had 22 major reports that have told them some variation on what the Royal Commission said. Instead of doing something to fix it, they've cut funding. Now, that won't be Labor's approach.
OK, just on how to pay for things like this, you've said a levy's not in consideration. What did you think of the Victorian government this week in its budget? Big mental health package paid for with an increased payroll tax charge on big business. We saw the Prime Minister leapt on this one, says this is how Labor pays for things. What did you think of this move?
I thought the Prime Minister's response was extraordinary. I mean, the government has lost all credibility to criticise anyone for fiscal responsibility for a generation.
What did you think of the Victorian Labor approach, though?
Well, I think, Victorian Labor's made its own call about what its budget can sustain.
What did you think of it?
But the fact that the government is pointing the finger at the Victorian government over fiscal responsibility just beggars belief to me.
What did you think of it?
They've just racked up the biggest debt that we're ever going to have as a country, $1 trillion by 2025.
So this is the question. Is it better to just use debt to pay for these sort of social goods, social benefits, or is taxing the way to go?
I think these things are instance by instance trade-offs, but I mean, it's a bit rich for the government to be criticising another level of government for taxation. Can I just remind you, the only major party that has a policy to increase taxes on Australians going into this election is Scott Morrison and the Liberals, because they're removing the low and middle income tax offset, which we'll see after the election. Many millions of Australians pay more in taxes than they do today. That's not Labor's policy.
OK, final question. We saw Labor thumped yesterday in a state by-election in New South Wales. The Upper Hunter by-election came just days after the Morrison government committed to a new taxpayer-funded gas plant in that part of the world. Do you think that played a part in the result?
Look, I think from my reading of this, it's been a National Party seat for 90 years, and the by-election result was exactly what everyone thought it would be coming into the by-election. So I don't think there are sort of big federal factors at play here. But can I just say with this gas plant, Labor's got a really clear position here. If the economics and the science back up the need for gas as a transition energy source, then we're very comfortable with that. What's unique about the Kurri Kurri project is that energy experts have essentially been falling over themselves to explain why this is not a good project. It's going to operate 2% of the time. It's going to employ 10 people full-time, $600 million for 10 people, and it's likely to raise energy prices in the area. So I just say we've had 8 long years of having no coherent energy and climate policy in Australia. It's time for Scott Morrison to stop using taxpayer dollars as his personal chequebook to win elections and by-elections, and put us on a path to our energy future, which is a great golden opportunity for us as a country.
Clare O'Neil, thanks for talking to us this morning.
Thanks so much, David.